most motivation prayers talk both about the refuge part of the prayer, which is to say, through taking refuge in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha and the three gems, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So this is the shortest sort of prayer that one finds. And what we're hoping to do is to say, okay, well, I now recognize and accept that our path is to do with the universal responsibility of benefiting all sentient beings. The best way in which I can benefit all beings continually is through having become a Buddha who is free, forever, permanently free from suffering, and is continually, within the Mahayana context, continually able to benefit all sentient beings that the Buddha has a relationship with, so has contact with, if you prefer, or rapport with. So in that sense, by being a Buddha, I'm able to spontaneously benefit many, many, many beings, infinite number, not every, but an infinite number anyway. And then within that, by taking refuge in the Buddha, the existing Buddhas, and also myself as the future Buddha, I am saying this is the path I have chosen. So it's not separate from, it's a part of the same process of saying, I take refuge in Buddha, the Dharma, his teachings, and the community that supports the practice in order to fulfill my goal, my wish, my desire, my ambition, if you will, to become enlightened, all only because of the wish to remove suffering from all beings. So to remove suffering and to bring joy. As I said before, in Buddhist thought, the word compassion is the intention to remove suffering. It is defined very closely to mean specifically that, the intention to remove suffering. And loving kindness, is the intention to bring joy. So these two are very, very closely defined. They're not they're not very wishy-washy. They're very precise, and they are slightly different in some contexts with the way in which they're used in the West. But the main meaning is obviously is to take on the burden of responsibility for all beings. And what we wanted to do today is to help ourselves, empower ourselves to be able to do that, and at least, if nothing else, in this session, to do what we can, just within the short amount of time we have this week, to think a little bit about, that sounds like something I can do. Yeah, so that's our motivation. And then, in terms of where we were, so as I said, we were really going through the precepts of refuge last week. And we covered what the Buddha, the Dharma, Sangha really mean, although we concentrated primarily on Buddha and enlightenment. And then we moved on to the precepts. And as I said last week, the precepts of refuge by Lama Tsong-kha-pa does not really talk about the 5 normal precepts that one hears about in general Buddhism discussions, or often in refuge ceremonies, which are to do with killing and stealing and lying and sexual misconduct and drinking. Not that these aren't found in Tibet. In fact, most Tibetan refuge ceremonies will include those 5, but more to do with the various different aspects of non-harm, generosity, practice, and so on. So in short, we were talking about the 10 types of offering, which I'll go through again very briefly, which were due to offerings to the Buddha's body on the shrines and to the stupas, to objects of the three jewels that I can perceive, and then those which I cannot perceive, in other words, those that I imagine, offerings made by myself, offerings made, offerings that I've helped other people to make, such as children. I've said, oh, would you like to make an offering to Buddha? Offerings of wealth and of service, so helping not just with money, but also with facilitating and helping the Sangha, particularly on their journeys and so on. A vast offering, which is to do with a continual daily or a frequent offering, those which are uncontaminated, such as it's not right to make offerings of stolen goods or poisons and things like that. Medicine's good, but not poisons. And then offering of practice. And we talked about how the right amount of time to practice is the same time as it takes to milk a cow, which is about 10 to 15 minutes. So this is what we covered last week, maybe a bit less than that. So one of the things is to say that when we recognize refuge, then the developed refuge requires us to have faith in it, and faith, as I said before in Buddhism, is not a blind faith; it's an experiential faith, a recognition based upon not belief but on experience. So when we can see or recognize the path of how a Buddha manifests, and we can recognize how the Buddha's path manifests and how the path to Buddhahood leads us to enlightenment, and when that's really clear, then we can really talk about refuge, taking refuge correctly, because then we're able to see, we have the faith, we have the conviction, we can recognize it, and with that recognition, we're then able to engage correctly in refuge. Later on, when we're more enlightened, after Path of Insight, so we have direct perception of emptiness, then our refuge is complete. We're able to be unwavering in our refuge. So, and when we're a Buddha, then we become the object of refuge. So that's there too. And it said when we can begin to, or hope to begin to understand the benefits, then it's good for us as a part of our practice to go for refuge 3 times in the morning and 3 times at night, or 6 times a day. And the normal formula is Namo Gurubhaya, or Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dhammaya, Namo Sanghaya. It changes very slightly from country to country, but that's about it. So then we have, I'm just checking, I haven't done all this already. So then there are some benefits. What are the benefits of refuge? And this is normally done within a meditation session on refuge, rather than just having to remember all of these things. So there are things to recollect. Well, one of the benefits of refuge is, of course, is that what we're doing is we're recognizing the truth of the Buddha's teachings, and we're taking refuge in the truth of Buddha's teachings, and that we believe, or we recognize the truth there. And because of that, our views cease to become so mistaken, and out of that, our actions become more pure, and because of that, we obtain a huge amount more merit, much more benefit. Likewise, as I said last week, because of giving and making offerings, giving in general is correlated with loving kindness, and it opens up our heart. So when we are able to offer to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, this itself, and this includes communities and community centers and so on. So all of these things, when we're able to freely offer even small amounts, then this has a very, very strong and powerful effect on our practice. It helps clear off obstacles or confusions about that. And it's very, very easy for us well, it's not always easy for us to do. Sometimes it's quite hard for us to do. We might struggle with it, as I said when I made an offering once to Geshe. But over time, as we have experience, we get more and more able. It becomes more easy for us to make these offerings. And this is really good, but it doesn't mean that we need to be wealthy. So it says, in terms of the example of how much benefit it arises, it says that the merit of going for refuge, if it took a form, the entire realm of the entire universe. So we know the universe is very, very massive, and it says that it would be the entire universe would be too small to contain the benefits of the merit of a form of taking refuge. And in the same way that a cupped hand cannot hold the Pacific Ocean. So it says actually the Great Ocean, and really what this means is it's all the connected oceans, the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Pacific Ocean. All is called the Great Ocean in Buddhist context. So it's like all of the water there is on the world. And he says also, quoting the collection of indicative verses, those who recollect the Buddha during the day and the night and go for refuge to Buddha gain the advantage of being human. And this is again really, although it says, again, it's like some sort of magic, formula. It's not like that. It's basically when we recognize how the teachings work, then we gain all the benefits of the teachings. So it's not as if it's some sort of magic trick. It's basically just saying when we recognize this, then of course we follow it, and that's what refuge is. By following it, we get the benefits. And of course, then he says we obtain the concentrations, and we obtain purity in our body and in our mind, and primarily in our mind actually. And this is because again we're following those teachings. But this is absolutely right. If we are able to practice in our day, in our daily life in a way which is completely in accordance with instructions given to us by our teachers, we find when we do meditation sessions, which will be a part of it, we'll find the meditation sessions particularly easy and very, very powerful, almost too powerful. And it can be a bit scary, but that's what we're working on, which is to develop the fearlessness of change, in terms of the fact that a part of our journey as developing an enlightening mind is that we see that a lot of things that we thought that we were stuck with, or that identified us or made us who we were, aren't really there, and that can be quite scary. So it's like, so often we find within ourselves, within our practice, especially when we have these powerful moments, there's a sort of a runaway sort of mindset. This is especially true if we have a few sort of not very clear views, and if we have a very, very clear view and a very, very strong faith, then there's less fear involved. So my own experiences on this has been very limited, but definitely I've noticed a sort of a eek sort of thing, right? So this is like definitely because my mind's not very good. Then I'm like, oh no, eek, a bit scary. So there's a tendency for this. This is when I was like, quite young. Then definitely saw that. And I had very fortunate to have these teachers, so it was very easy to follow their instructions and practice very hard at that time. Nowadays I'm lazy. So then there's other benefits are to do with having great protection. This means that there are all sorts of sort of qualifications where there's certain types of spirit that are quite sentient beings or whatever, who can be quite destructive. But if they see your mind, they see the aspect of your mind, which remember is compassionate towards them because it's compassionate to all, then the strength of that aggression is actually diminished. And you can see this with humans sometimes too, but it's not as if it's some sort of magic again. It's actually to do with the fact that because one's able to relate at as a peer, as a somebody who understands what it, who's empathizing and recognizing the difficulty of the current situation in a way which is understood by the aggressor, the aggressors feels less able to externalize, and in that sense can sometimes very, very much diminish their aggression. Not always, but sometimes, definitely. And so on. So, and likewise, you're counted among the most excellent people who have accomplished the sublime. And this is sort of really saying that when we take refuge, when we actually start practicing correctly, what we we can recognize is that we're sincere in our practice, in our spiritual practice. We are completely sincere in it. We're not just being a Buddhist because it looks good, or because we like the idea, or because we're looking for validation from our parents or from our siblings or from our spouse or from our friends, or because we like the group, or because we like the coffee or the cakes that are being made by the group, or any of that. In the end, we're thinking Vedita, right? So it's lovely cake and lovely food and stuff, but in the end, really, it's whether or not we're sincere in our practice, and that's what really matters. And that quality is really what we're looking at. And yes, of course, we all have our own. We all, in the end, have to choose the path that we take in the way that we take it. So there are differences of opinion sometimes, and so on. It's not as if there's some unified view, but at the same time, there's a level of generosity of spirit, generosity of behavior, and a willingness and a sincere intention to be harmonious, to work towards a harmonious environment. And this has a dramatic effect. So having a strong refuge is all about being a good practitioner in that sense as well. Not only that, when your teachers like His Holiness or like Geshe Damshala or so on, when they see you, then there's joy arises in their mind because they see that you're being sincere in your practice. And this is much, much more important than anything else, like the size of your donation or whatever. And likewise, they feel a sense of confidence in in the path as well. So even if one has a very highly realized teacher, the teacher can feel a little bit like, it's, just always work, no progress, because all my students aren't really doing very much. But when they see a student, even a single student, progressing on the path, it fills them with joy. And we see this with even with stories from the sutras, from the Buddha Sutra. And then he says also, you're included amongst, this is Lam Rim Tsongkhapa, you're included amongst the Buddhists. You can say, I'm a Buddhist. And although there are, as we said before, and he says there are many different ways to distinguish Buddhist from non-Buddhist, if we want to make that. But one of the widely acknowledged ways of recognizing a Buddhist from a non-Buddhist is according to the refuge that we take. And therefore, for those who are taking refuge or who acknowledge the Buddha Dharma as a valid path, it would be very complicated, it would be very difficult to say then that's not non-Buddhist. So in many ways, we can say if we recognize refuge, then we can say, yes, I'm Buddhist. One of the questions that has actually been asked many times is, do I need to sort of formally take refuge in order to call myself a Buddhist? And the answer is no. It is nice for a sense of validation for oneself sometimes to take refuge formally, and to get a Tibetan name or a refuge name, and say, oh no, I've got, and sort of be, I've got my refuge Lama and all that sort of thing, or my teacher and so on. But in the end, actually, the refuge is from here, from the mind, right? But the Tibetan or Asian tradition sees the mind in the heart here, right, rather than here. So I do both, but when I'm thinking of Geshe-la, he's sort of the mind, he's here. So I'm like, okay, yeah. So they're from the mind, so we generate refuge from the mind, and when we generate refuge, when we recognize the Buddha Dharma as a valid path, and we are determined to follow it, we say, okay, I want to follow it, and we accept the refuge formula that we're going to say 3 times a day, and we engage in the refuge practice and the precepts. Then to not call ourselves a Buddhist might be a bit odd. But then some people don't want to call themselves Buddhist because they feel if I say I'm Buddhist, then people misunderstand it. That's absolutely fine. It's inside your mind that matters most. So it doesn't matter, really. You don't need to say, oh, well, really, I'm a Christian, or really, I'm a Buddhist, or whatever. That's your choice, right? In fact, in many ways, it's far better not to go around announcing what I am, because why is that interesting to anybody, right? It's all about me. I'm a Buddhist. It's like, well, yeah, okay. So for children, it's nice, and so on, and for people who need a sense of identity, it's important. But in many other ways, actually, whether or not I'm a Buddhist, whether or not I choose to be a Buddhist, whether or not I choose to be a Bodhisattva, whether or not I choose any of these things to be spiritual, this is a choice that is internal rather than something to announce. And likewise, because of that, there is no sort of refuge party. There are no celebrations of our boys become a Buddhist, let's all celebrate. That just doesn't happen. In fact, generally, the refuge ceremonies are private. They're not public events in that sense. I'm sure you can find in other traditions where there are, but in the specific tradition that we follow in Lam Rim, or traditionally, it's not the case. And once, if or when we're ready, then also we can take on vows, the refuge vows as taught beforehand, but also the 10 virtues or non-virtues, or the lay vows, or even the novice or the monastic vows. And this has many benefits because, as I said before, when we're holding a vow, the benefit of that continues from moment to moment, because the vow is, I will not do this ever again. So then the restraint or the prevention of doing that thing has a continuation to it, which is very powerful. But if you can't keep the vow, better not to take it, right? The whole point about this is to say, if I say I vow never to kill an animal again, and then I swat at a fly or a mosquito, the vow is broken, which is like, oh, well, so the vow didn't mean as much as it could have done because I've weakened it by breaking it. So in that sense, it's better really to say, I won't kill, as a general rule, as a precept, I won't kill, rather than trying to take on a vow that I might find hard to take on. So in general rule, in fact, Geshe said to many people who said, "Oh, I want to become a monk, I want to become a nun," and he said again and again, "Don't. If you want to be a monk, you want to be a nun, live like a monk, live like a nun. You don't need to do the robes, you don't need to do the vows. It's far easier just to make the choice and live that way, rather than holding yourself up and then not being able to sustain them. You might even be able to keep for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years." But to be a Western, especially where there's no monastic community and no longer is there really a monastic culture, to try to sustain that is just a mistake. It won't happen. And in fact, in many ways, he said, you only have to look at how many different famous translators and teachers and so on. Initially, they started off as monks and they lost their vows. So it is far better not to hold a vow, but just to sustain the precepts and live that way while you can. So. Yeah. So there's this discussion here about Je Rinpoche is talking about a god who saw a deva. It belongs to the deva realms, a higher sort of realm, and the deva saw that he or she they were going to be reborn as a pig, and although there's nothing specific wrong about being reborn as a pig, this particular god was very unhappy about it and felt deeply concerned. And a bodhisattva who was in the Deva realms at the time said, well, you can avoid this rebirth if you take refuge. And the deity said, okay, well, out of fear for being reborn as a pig, initially took refuge, recognized Buddha Dharma, started practicing and was able to overcome rebirth as a pig and instead become reborn as a human, I think. So again, he says, we've already talked about the merit and also prevention of falling into the lower realms, because we are sustaining our virtue, because we're reckoning this is what the refuge is. And again, not being thwarted by human or non-human hindrances, which I sort of have alluded to earlier on. And again, then he says, you will accomplish everything you wish, which is sort of sounds a little bit like a sales pitch. You know, this is the wish granting gem, right? You can, whatever you wish for, you can have it because you've taken refuge. And in many ways, yes, the refuge is a wish granting gem, but as long as the wish is to become a Buddha. So, or to become enlightened, or to achieve nirvana, because this is what the mission is. This is what our project is. So that's right. And then in fact, the next one is you'll quickly achieve Buddhahood, which is the fulfillment of all our wishes, like that. Yeah. So he's just making it clear that this is the case. And then he says we need to sustain our refuge and not to forsake our refuge, even in jest or if it costs us our life. And I mentioned this last week about in the debate courtyards in the large monasteries, where they are developing their skill in thinking very carefully about logic and reasoning. They're allowed to forsake their refuge. They're allowed to say, oh, Buddha's all rubbish, you know, but only because they're doing that as a part of a way of trying to establish a strong argument for the opponent. But in all other cases, to say, you know, to say these things out of is a joke or out of a threat is considered to be mistaken. Having said that, of course, the other people have said, and especially more recently since the invasions in the 1950s, have said, if you can say it without meaning it, and it sustains you, or sustains your family, or sustains your community, or sustains your culture, to say that as a way of being able to prevent further damage, there's no harm. Yeah. So it's only really if we're it's better for us to survive and to lie in this particular case under duress from a threat, than it is for us to have to sort of keep our feelings public. However, of course, when in these Middle Ages in India, when there were the large Muslim invasions, many Buddhists died because they refused to give up their refuge and also the practices they followed, and there were many deaths. And he says, you know, there are specific cases where, in terms of whether or not one has forsaken, given up one's refuge, he goes into particular detail, but in the end, it comes down to saying whether or not I trust Buddha. And that really, in the end of it, is, do I trust Buddha? Do I trust the Dharma? And do I recognize the Buddha Dharma as being a valid truth, a valid path, and a reason for practicing? And that, in the end, is really the distinction. He goes into some specific details, but that's essentially it. And lastly, in terms of this chapter, he then says, you know, remember the collection of indicative verses. Buddha says, I, the Tathagata, the teacher, reveal to you the path that stops the pains of existence. You must follow it. So this was really it's the Buddha is the one who teaches the refuge. It's the community that helps us accomplish the refuge. But the true refuge, the real refuge, is the jewel of the teaching. Because once we have attained the jewel of the teaching, we are liberated from fear completely. So the ultimate teaching jewel is defined as being a special quality of increasing two things: the elimination of thoughts of a beginning practitioner, and then which leads us into the accomplished practitioner of a realized being. And that takes us to the end of the refuge chapter and precepts of refuge. And we're now moving on to the general characteristics of karma. So this is quite a short chapter, and the previous chapter is quite long. So I thought it's probably okay to combine these two this week. So at this point, what we've sort of done is we've moved from just the foundation, the foundation levels of why we should practice or how to practice in terms of a meditation session, how a recognition of our precious human rebirth and death awareness helps to bring us to recognizing the importance of using our lives to their fullest. And then what we've done is we moved from, as well as relying on the teacher, we then talked about, to a degree, the three lower realms, both in a metaphoric but also in a practical way of how we can consider our future lives, but also consider the future lives and the states of suffering of all sentient beings, and develop compassion based on suffering. And from that, we are recognizing that refuge is the sole refuge to enable us to do that is the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, of which the most important is the Dharma. So within that scope, what we're now saying is we've established that the Dharma provides us with the truths that we need to actually complete the path. We recognize the need to engage in the path because of death and precious human rebirth, and also because we need to be able to become a Buddha in order both to remove suffering from ourselves and also for all sentient beings. So he said that therefore what we now need to work on is to recognize what is good and what is bad, right? And how that works. So non-virtue and virtue, how that works, and what the mechanisms are and why they're important and how they're defined. So it's not enough just to give a list of what you shouldn't do and what you should do. We really need to understand the mechanism behind them. And the reason why we need to understand that is because otherwise we don't really have the conviction to recognize these things. We need to sort of understand it on sort of core principles, if you like. And he says, if we don't recognize how these things work, then even though we might not want to, we might want to escape from the lower realms, the miserable realms. We won't know how to escape it. We won't see the mechanism by doing that. And he says, so therefore, in order to be protected from low rebirth, but also in terms of being able to achieve enlightenment, we need to restrain from those activities which cause suffering both in the short and the long term, and we want to engage in those activities which cause joy both in the short and the long term, and this restraint and engaging helps us, it depends upon us recognizing karma. So what is karma? And I was talking earlier on about this, and sort of given the advice that what we should really be doing is to forget everything we know about karma before we carry on, because there are lots and lots of ways in which the word karma is used, especially in the West, but also in Asia, which are not necessarily going to be very helpful to us. And one of the problems is that we sort of imagine that there's some sort of just world, and that if we if we do wrong, then we're going to be punished, and likewise people who we see having misfortune are being punished, and these sorts of behaviors. So we've got to avoid this particular pitfall. So first of all, he says is what we need to do is to, and we'll go into this in more detail. So some of this is going to be straight from the text. Some of this is going to be extensions from the text, not because I'm making it up, but because certain aspects of this are much more relevant to us in the modern world than they were to 14th century Tibet, or possibly not, but certainly these are part of a long conversations that many of us have had. So one of the aspects of this is definitely to say that a karma traditionally means action, so action, yeah? And then within that action, the point is that all actions have consequences. There's nothing that you do that doesn't have a consequence. So this is both what's known as inner and outer karma. So causality in terms of causes, creating causes, actions. Actions are always involved. They don't stand alone. They're not unique. They're not independent. They're involved. They involve, if you want, objects and subjects, or agents and so on. And the point about actions, therefore, is that they are causes. They create causes. They don't just create one cause. It's not as if this specifically causes just that. There are all sorts of other causes that are affected. And as we know, even the most simple of actions end up with this great web of interlinked consequences. Yeah, even in physics. So it doesn't matter. We're not just talking about Buddhism. We're talking about straight science. So within the sense of actions and consequences, there are sort of two types specifically. One which is general causation, as found in modern physics or Newtonian physics, the same sort of thing. And the other one is internal or inner action, and this is what affects us more psychologically. So in terms of the psychological effect of what happens next. And the psychology and the physical, the inner and the outer actions are not independent. They correlate and they correspond to each other in many, many different ways. So when I speak, it's both a psychological and also a physical action. And it's not just the speech that I give or a speech that I make is not just the physical sort of sound waves. There are all sorts of things that happen. So if I say to somebody, sit down, and they sit down, that speech is a contributing factor to them sitting down as a cause. It's a contributing cause. But likewise, one could argue, well, is that an inner or an outer one? The point is, it doesn't really make much sense to have to always divide these things up, right? It's just like, well, we just end up all confused because it's like, well, there's this, and then is that a social action, or is it so it's not really very important. What's important is that I have some involvement in that. So therefore, there's some sort of responsibility in terms of what I say, and somebody, which could be myself, but somebody has also been affected by it. So there's definitely a sense of this action has had an effect elsewhere. And as we can see, without using any sort of magic or whatever, this is action at a distance. So I can say to somebody, even in France right now, I could say, wave your hand. And for all I know, somebody might wave their hand back. And that's sort of action at a distance, which is sort of this idea that is sort of not really talked about within physics too much, but certainly is definitely available to us psychologically or culturally. So What we're saying is that the important thing about this is that all actions are causes. They're causal, and therefore there are always corresponding effects. Not just one, many different ones, and these are webbed. There's sort of a great big web of interrelated effects. And why is this important? Because karma means, in this sense, is relating to these causes. Yeah. So we see later. So actions and talk about actions and fruit, or causes and fruit. This is just another way of saying causes and consequences, right? So then the point is saying, within this, there are those actions which are, so typically within a Buddhist sense, there are those actions which are mental, those which are speech, and those which are physical. And this doesn't mean that they're not, again, correlating. So we can say, I have an intention to hurt somebody, and then I hurt them physically. There is a correlating action of the hurting, and there was also, if you like, the path to action, which was my intent to hit, to strike, or to harm. So we have the path to action, but we also recognize within that path to action that there was the intent itself, which itself is an action, it's a mental action. So what is it about that allows for that mental action to take place? And this is the wrong view, or the negative view, which is the true path to action, which is saying the idea that somehow my aggression, my desire to punish that child is legitimate. So by saying, that child's done something wrong, I'm going to therefore strike, and I strike. That initial thought, which is that punishment is a legitimate means of being able to establish some sort of action against that child, is valid. And that there is the wrong view, which is the path to action directly to both the mental thought, which is the intention, and the physical action of striking. So what we're seeing is then, of course, is the huge number of long-term consequences from a single action. And we can see this even within a normal social cultural environment. We can find what are called transgenerational effects, where a particular behavior of a single individual from sometimes many generations back is providing the same sorts of behaviors repetitively, repeatedly happening from parent to child, or from brother to sister to child, or whoever it is, again, from generation to generation to generation. And these aren't just about punishments and things. It's also to do the way in which I think about myself, the way in which I consider myself to be, who I am, my identity, the way in which I develop a value system. All of these things are available to me, not just within families, also within schools or within organizations. We find exactly the same, where there's a transgenerational, a sort of a culture of accepting and rejecting certain types of behaviors being legitimate. And this is what we're struggling with, trying to work out how best to heal those toxic behaviors which cause trouble, right? So within that, even though often one might have a benign intention, one might not mean to do it, might not have a direct intention to create harm, but the response generated is one which is, I've been harmed, which itself can then become a very, very negative, reflective future. So it's not as if one can easily point the finger and say, oh yeah, it's great-great-great-grandma, she said that, and ever since then we've all been struggling, because she may have meant it in a completely different way, which was then turned or responded to in a different sort of sense. So what we know, though, is that regardless of whether or not her intent was there, the action still caused harm. And it caused harm, and it caused a magnification of harm that goes this way. Now, all of this is true. It's true in Buddhism, it's true in it's all available for us to see. And this is what's sort of relevant to us, is that we can actually see these things happening both in our own lives and in our own families, but also in those of others, and also organizations and so on. So our responsibility is to recognize these narratives, especially these toxic narratives, and try to contain them and heal them. Yeah. And within that, then we're actually working on breaking those long causal webs that create repeated behaviors, toxic behaviors. So the certainty of karma, which is the point being made first of all by Lama Tsongkhapa, is that it is certain, is the recognition that whatever actions we do, there are definitely going to be consequences to it. Now, sometimes they're benign consequences. There's nothing strike. Even sometimes there's an evil intent, and the immediate effect is very weak, but the intent is resting on the laurels, if you like, or the spikes of wrong view, is that's going to generate and come back again and again and again in the future. So it's not as if we were just looking at the one. We can look at the basic nature or of the mind that's currently distorted to the point where it's actually causing trouble. So regardless, even the smallest amount, even the smallest fantasy that we might have of, I really want to give that guy needs a bit of a what for, that Ben is just full of rubbish, he needs a bit of a what for, I want to punish him, right? The intention to punish is exactly what is an intention to harm. So when we recognize that actually there's no distinction between the intention to punish and the intention to harm, then we begin to see how easy it is to slip into a negative karma, right? Causing of suffering. So the definition of black karma or negative karma is not about race. Of negative karma is that which causes suffering. So bad karma or downward karma is that which is a cause of suffering. That which is good karma is that which is a cause of happiness. Very, very straightforward, nothing complex. The ramifications of how a specific action takes place and how it expands out and how people respond to it, very complex, right? Really not straightforward. So we're working all the time to trying to recognize our responsibility, our intents, trying to keep it clean, but also recognizing that even in our best, when we're doing our best to communicate, to make sure that we're not missing a trick, that we're not going to be that somebody might pick it up in a negative response. This is our job. This is what we're working on to sustain, is to recognize, no, we've got to be able to ensure that we're not allowing as much as we can, that our actions aren't causing suffering and are also causing non-suffering. So one of the other effects, and again, this is the magnification of karma, which is, he says, is that if we look at a small cause, it seems very, very slight. But what we see is there's this spread of effects that goes deeply, way across society. And we can't track them all because we're not able to recognize how these single views, these single moments, which themselves are a part of a large causal chain, how they are interacting with each other. But what we know for sure is that amazing stuff can happen with good events. Really, really strong cultural changes can happen just from a single interaction that we make. And likewise, amazing, dramatic disasters can happen from a single small criticism that we make. And that is the responsibility that we are holding. If we're taking on the responsibility of the universe, of all beings, which is the Mahayana path, then we've got to be aware of the magnification of each of our actions, and therefore the importance of our mindfulness and vigilance in terms of maintaining and containing our emotional and mental actions and physical, and therefore the corresponding speech and physical actions, such that and in fact, in many ways, what's so interesting is the power of narrative is so deeply entrenched sometimes that when somebody stands up and says, I will not strike that child, or even shows that they will not strike that child, we can see entire cultures change on that one single action. right? So being able to transform and transform a narrative from let's just carry on with the status quo, this is how we've always done it, to saying, no, I recognize, and I not only can I recognize, but I can provide the, I can show you directly, just through action or through inaction, I can show you directly what's wrong with what we've been doing. People wake up, and they do wake up, and we see it. And these are some of the beautiful moments in our lives. And it could be a schoolgirl, or it could be an old grandmother, or it could be an entrenched teacher, or it could be a civil servant. It doesn't matter who that person is, but the event happens, and you see the ramifications going across the world. And that's what's so beautiful about us. And we have the opportunity, not necessarily to change the world every moment, but certainly to think about how we can do our best to contribute. And in fact, in many ways, we don't want to be famous. What we want to do is to make the world a better place. So this is the magnification of karma, this idea that primarily even the very, very small event that looks insignificant can have this very strong consequence, right? And he's Lama Tsongkhapa talks from the collection of indicative verses. We were using it earlier on, talking about Buddha saying, I teach Dharma. He says it's like a poison that's been ingested. He's talking about a negative effect. The commission of even a tiny sin or non-virtuous action creates in our lives thereafter a great fear and terrible downfall. So you only need a tiny amount of poison, and you can find yourself very, very sick or dead. And so it's not as if we need to have a big piece of poison for a big effect, right? And he says again, and a good model for this traditional model for thinking about the opposite is, in terms of a metaphoric approach, is how you might have a single grain of wheat or barley, and you plant it, and you get a single ear of grain, which you plant again, and then in 5 years' time you have enough barley to feed the village, right? So it doesn't take much to see how a single grain can actually provide food for hundreds of people, and therefore we can see in terms of these, although these are metaphoric, we can also see how in our modern world, how even a very, very small action can have a very large consequence. And I mean, not that I'm wishing to be political or anything. A good example of a very, very powerful phrase that was used and has spread across the world and caused a lot of suffering. A single phrase, fake news, right? And it's changed a whole lot of culture just with those two words. So we've got to be very aware of what it is we say and the power of what it is that we do. So another aspect of this is saying that one, in terms of the experience of effects of actions that were not done, and this is really a double negative. So the point about it is to say the consequences of what we do are strong, but the consequences of what not done do not. So what I'm trying to say is effects do not arise unless there are causes. Yeah. So what that means is that essentially any event, anything that any consequences only arise where there have been these causes in the first place. This is both true in terms of positive and negative causes. So we can't imagine that things arise causelessly. We can talk about random physical events, if you like, but in many cases, actually, when we go back to physics, what we see is anything above some tiny space measured in Planck lengths or something, and I'm really not a physicist. We find ourselves straight into causality again. But in terms of what we're really interested in, which isn't physics, it's mind, what we're saying is that if we don't have these, if we don't give rise to these causes, then we can't expect to see consequences from them. And that's relevant because we can then say, given a state of affairs of the world, that the state of the affairs of the world have arisen because of what it is that we've been doing or what has been done in the past. And the last point which he makes is that what we have done does not perish. It doesn't go away. We can't eliminate those causes. Consequences arise, and once they arise, they very, very quickly have, as I said, this web, this chain of causality that reaches out to the universe. They're not undoable. There's no undo button. I don't know if you've ever, I mean, being a computer early on in computer days, I remember it's like, I need to undo, I need to rewind. It's not available to us. We can't undo or rewind what's been done. And likewise, therefore, the consequences, if we do something wrong, we could do our best to compensate for them. And we do. We try very hard to say, you know, I didn't mean that. I'm really sorry. What can I do? How can I help? You know, I took this thing. I didn't realize it was yours. Here, let me give you, you know, £1 million or whatever. I'm really sorry. And yet, all we're doing is we're just, in a sense, creating more causes. We're not stopping or undoing what we've done already. What we're doing is creating additional causes, which we're hoping, which will help to rebalance some of the upset. Normally, in this particular case that I'm sort of describing, to rebalance the upset that I may have caused. So, or that we may have caused. So these four basic truths about karma, right, get much more complex if we start trying to talk about it in terms of what happens in our lives. So how I am affected by my actions. Now, within the Buddhist context, in the traditional Buddhist context, it's not only do what I do happens to others in terms of a causal relationship, but also I can expect that sort of thing to happen to me. And this has led to all sorts of difficult complexities about how does, you know, if I kill somebody, I'm in future lives, I'm going to be killed, or I'm going to be more prone to killing, and so on. But if we remember that one of the aspects of rebirth is that it's talking about, rebirth is talking about moment-to-moment conscious change, right? Our consciousness, our mind, is never is never still. It's always moving from moment to moment. And the birth of one moment of consciousness arises from the death of the previous one. So within this, what we're saying is that the continuum of mind is, if you like, also the continuum of rebirths. And it is only through the continuum of mind that we can achieve enlightenment, right? And so within that point, what we're saying is that the continuum of mind, there is no doubt that the causes that I commit at one point, the actions that I make at one point, have a very strong psychological effect on subsequent moments of my consciousness, right? So putting lives to one side for the moment, at a psychological, mental, emotional, and universal level, there is no argument to be had about karma. In terms of how karma affects us as individuals, we can definitely say, if we accept a rebirth, we can definitely say that the mental continuum provides us with the basis for a karmic effect. And in that sense, we can say, remember, we were talking about rebirth in terms of whirlpools, which come and go over winters and summers, or waterfalls that dry up and then reappear the next rainy season. So those things we say, oh, look, there's the waterfall again. And likewise, when we recognize that the energy that is us, that is our mental state, when the energy arises again, then we arise again. We don't need to have any intermediary sort of a ghost or whatever to be, or spirit. We arise just as as a spirit, as the fountain, the waterfall reappears, or the whirlpool reappears on a rainy season. And in that sense, what we can say is just the same as a waterfall or a whirlpool or whatever, is that the causes, the underlying ramifications of those particular effects, the way, the structure, the patterns created within the waterfall or within the whirlpool are affected by its own energy, its own force. And likewise, there we can say that if I have a mental capacity for aggression in one life, then why on earth would I not expect that mental capacity for aggression to arise in a second life or a third life, and so on. So there we have, within rebirth, not only do we see within the personal, psychological, social and universal senses of causality, as well as physical, but also within a rebirth to rebirth, without us even having to get involved in anything more than accepting the energy that gives life that provides us with our characteristics may reappear. Yeah. And if we find that hard, then we probably find a lot of rebirth hard anyway. But regardless, and this is why I make this the case, is that the certainty, magnification, the definition, and the non-perishing of cause, both psychological, social, and the rest, are still absolutely available to us as truths. Yeah. Why are we talking about this? Not because Ben wants to go rabbiting on about his philosophy or anything, because by meditating on that, it helps us to put energy in, it helps empower us to feel the impact and import of responsibility in terms of our actions, right? The purpose of this is for us to begin to distinguish and recognize how important it is for us to be very, very clear about how we must take on responsibility for what we do, what we say, and what we think. And that's why we're doing this. So this is a meditation on karma, is about helping us develop a sense of responsibility by considering the importance of actions. What we do not do, and this is why I said forget everything first, what we do not do is to concentrate on things like the Glenn Hoddle thing of saying, oh, well, the Jews died because it was, their karma. It's like you've missed every single point of what karma is about by saying things like that, right? We are not interested in the effects of karma in terms of saying, oh yes, they did well because they're millionaires. They did badly because they're ill all the time. What we're saying is the karma, and the purpose of karma is to develop responsibility for our actions. And that's what we're working on with karma. And more to the point is, if we want to talk about, if we really need to talk about something like the Holocaust, and this is a very, very, a very, very powerful subject. I'm not denying that. Is to say that within the context of karma and within the context of Buddhism, there are several things that we can learn which are absolutely valuable to us. One of them is that of the entire Jewish population within Europe that were affected by the Nazi regime, I think it was one in 20 survived. Yeah, it's a tiny, tiny, horrific number of deaths. And what that says to us is about 1 in 20 of us would survive a similar sort of crisis. In other words, we can say within a strong Buddhist karmic sense, we all have the causes to be killed, to be destroyed, to be hammered to pulp, to be gassed, to be burnt. We all have those causes. We've all done all of those things over countless lives. We all have this huge amount of backdrop of evil, of negative karma that allows for itself to be ripened. And when it is ripened, The consequences for its ripening could be anything. It doesn't have to be Nazis. It doesn't have to be this, that, or the other. It could be anything, right? And what we see is about 1 in 19 people will not be affected directly, and that will show us that this is how many people have, if you like, have these sorts of problems. It's nothing to do with Nazis. It's all to do with the fact that we all have this huge burden of karma if we want to use this sort of traditional Buddhist approach. But I'm not convinced this is even very relevant to us, especially not as Mahayana practitioners, where our concern is universal. Concern is everybody, not ourselves anyway. And within that sense, it's like it doesn't really matter whether or not I in my future lives will see a direct correlation to my actions. What I need to be concerned with is everyone, and how everyone is affected by everything that I do every single moment. That's what's important. And in many ways, when we want to boil down to the specifics of our spiritual practice, is to make sure that we do the right thing at every single moment that we can. So then Je Rinpoche goes on, and going back to sort of traditional karma again, is he says, there's so many different things, so maybe I can't talk about all of them, but for instance, some people talk about group karma or national karma, so it's not really there. These things, primarily, sometimes there are consequences which affect large groups of people, and therefore there are lots of karma that ripens. The fact that it happens to a specific group at a given time has got nothing to do with that group. This is within the scope of rebirth and the idea of somehow the difficulties that I've already caused for myself, which can be ageless. In fact, one of the things that in terms of non-perishing, the basis of discipline, the Vinaya text says, even in 100 universal ages, karma does not perish. When the circumstance and the time arrive, beings will feel the effect. So this is, I'm not making this up. This is the traditional Buddhist consideration. For us to then think somehow that this group of people did something together that created this sort of problem is sort of just a mistaken view. But the other thing that's mistaken is for us to assume that my action, my determination, or my decision to do something was because of my karma, right? My prior karma. Therefore, I gave up on this because of my karma. And this is just a mistake. This is also a mistake, because karma is about accepting responsibility for our actions, not an excuse for not doing it, not following our actions. Because otherwise we could say, oh, well, yeah, the reason why I killed my wife was because of karma. So it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because karma isn't a consequence in that sense. Now, you could argue in many ways that it's, well, then you say this and then you said something else earlier, and it's true. But what we also are looking at is the fact that we still have the opportunity to transform, given the moment, to be responsible in that moment. I may have killed 3 of my wives. I haven't killed anybody, but I may have killed 3 of my wives. That doesn't mean that I necessarily need to kill my 4th, right? So in that sense, the idea is to say that just because what I've done previously has led me into a particular path, I still have the opportunity to say, this is enough. This is time to stop. This is enough right now. And therefore, because I have that responsibility, this is the moment where I can actually make a dramatic change. And that's what, if you like, when Lama Tsong-kha-pa was talking about a deity becoming a pig, this is what it's about. I can say, actually, this is where the line is drawn. And what we want to do is to do that as early as possible. And in fact, Ken Pema Rinpoche said in teachings in Lam Rim years ago, he said, with anger especially, but also with other actions, it's like You start off with a snowball. It's a very, very small snowball, and it's very easy to stop. It's not even hard to stop. Being aware that it's there is absolutely necessary. Being mindful of the fact that the snowball has just started is necessary. But if we can see it, we can stop it. But often we do not. And when we don't, that snowball can become an avalanche, and then nothing can stop it. And the disaster can be absolutely crazy, really, really mammoth. So we have to do our best to pick ourselves up and say, I can do better than this. Yeah. And this is personal responsibility. Sometimes we might be able to influence others. We might be able to say, by questioning or being able to point out what's going on, we might be able to do something to prevent other people making disasters. And that's a wonderful thing when we can do it. But most of the time, what we're doing is looking at how we can do the best for everybody, including ourselves, how we can contain our emotions, and also this includes judgment about ourselves. So there's a tendency, often, especially in modern society, but I think also in traditional Asian societies, of feeling a need to punish ourselves because of what I did wrong, or to blame, to be really miserable about, and somehow by being miserable, I am punishing myself. These sort of punishing behaviors. So it's not just the child, it's also ourselves. And we see this behavior and it's like saying, hang on, I can do something about this right now. It's time for this to stop. Yeah, I need to contain my emotion, find a way of being generous enough to have the loving kindness towards myself. And I'm not one for talking about love yourself first or anything like that, but to be able to contain and recognize the importance of being able to contain our emotions, to be able to give ourselves the compassion and loving kindness that we need in a moment to say, no, this is no good anymore. And also to recognize that saying, I've done so wrong in the past, and therefore become depressed or miserable, isn't really helping. It's all I'm doing is continuing to punish. Whereas what I could be doing is saying, okay, well, I won't do it anymore, right? Time to change. This is the moment I can change, right? Therefore, what do I need to be miserable about? I've got the opportunity to do something right now. And yes, I'm aware of the fact that we are caught up in the avalanches of our own making, right? But these sorts of things are available to us. So Je Rinpoche then says, look, in terms of the complications and the ramifications of our actions, we as practitioners, there are sort of there are four basic jobs, if you like, for us to do. One of them is to keep ethical discipline, to sustain an ethical way of life, doing the right thing, avoiding doing the wrong thing. The other one is to keep our practice, to make sure that all the commitments that we've been given, such as to do refuge prayers or to do pujas or to do meditation practice, to keep those going. So to keep our daily or our monthly or our weekly practice. Our livelihood, and this means the work, is not really necessarily to do with having a job or keeping a job. This is about to make sure that the way in which we live spiritually is maintained and sustained. So not just our ethical discipline, not just our practice, but also our spiritual life in terms of the activities we do and the work that we do, keeping our practice. So a lot of the time, like for instance, looking at Lam Rim, looking after the house, cleaning it, gardening, all of this is because it's a Dharma center, is Dharma work, right? You're doing the accounts. It's not just about physical labor, but those sorts of things. It's like saying Dharma work in this sense is work. It's not practice and it's not ethics. It's not without that, but that's it. And the last one is philosophical view, sustaining and maintaining a view which accepts the truth of Buddha Dharma, right? So we need to take on a view where we need to be able to explore our views, but we need to also recognize the truths that are foundations of our practice. And those truths include recognizing karma, which is exactly what we're talking about right now, and the importance of the responsibility driven by karma. Karma is probably, of all the philosophical views, actually not as hard to understand as we may initially think, in terms of looking at it in terms of the fact of causal effects. But it is also probably the most important philosophical view that one can have within Buddhism, because it's the basis of our sense of responsibility, of understanding our responsibility. So another one obviously is to recognize death and death awareness, and that provides us with a backdrop for recognizing the truth of death. And as we recognize the truth of death, there is this paradoxical awareness that frees us from the fear of death, because we recognize it as just being a truth. There's no point being afraid of it. So we have these. This is another philosophical view that we cannot, that we do not want to burn, to destroy. So these four are the sort of the four jobbies that we have as a practitioner, and ethical discipline, practice, livelihood or work, and viewpoint. And Lama Tsongkhapa talks, he says, actually citing again from a sutra called The Question of the Naga King, Kings of the Ocean. And this is a discussion being had by the Naga kings with Buddha. And so now, normally, of course, everyone's like, okay, fine, but what is a Naga? Yeah? A Naga is, in the Chinese Buddhism, the Naga is sort of like a snake. But in the Chinese tradition, they weren't happy with all these Nagas with all these amazing powers being talked about in the sutras. And so they translated them as dragons. And that's why we have all these Chinese dragons, is because Nagas feature a lot in especially in the early Buddhist texts. And the Chinese were like, okay, well, we don't want snakes. They're boring, yucky things. So they became dragons, dragony sort of moustaches and long tails and so on. And that's like, it's no criticism. I think it's very sweet. So in a way, it's a spiritual being that's sort of rather snake-like, that tends to live in the ocean. And there are all sorts of things about them that are particularly like to do with poison and so on. But they are also, they generally find human beings repugnant. They find them smelly, not because they've got sweat, but because humans, untrained humans, are sort of weak in discipline, and they find that very, very difficult, because supposedly from the Naga King, question of the Naga kings, is that their previous lives, they were unable to sustain good ethical discipline. And they were unable to. So the point about it is that so I can read it as a sort of story. It's a question being asked by the Naga king to Buddha, Bhagavan, the Buddha. Bhagavan, in the beginning of the eon, the universe, I lived in a great ocean, and at that time the Tathagata Krakuchanda was in the world. So now is Shakyamuni Buddha, but before, I think 3 Buddhas before was Krakuchanda. And at that time, the Nagas and their sons and daughters within the great ocean had become very few, and I had a very, very few followers. But now, Bhagavan, the Nagas and their sons and daughters within the great ocean are immeasurable, and their numbers know no limit. Oh, Bhagavan, what are the causes and the conditions for this? So again, I mentioned that the great ocean is the combined oceans of the sea, the combined seas of the world. And he's saying, I think you probably understand, but he's saying that a long time ago there were very few of us, and now there are loads. What's going on? And Bhagavan responded, said, "O Lord of Nagas, There have been those who renounced the world and went forth into the discipline, in other words, became monks or nuns, but they did not completely perfect their discipline. They did not perfect their practice, and their practices deteriorated. They weren't working as hard, and their work deteriorated. But their view remained pure. Therefore, because they sustained the pure view, they weren't born in the hells. Instead, they were reborn as nagas, as animal, which is a type of animal, a spiritual animal. And then he goes into some detail from another text, which is exactly how many 100 trillion billion million nagas there currently are, and why they're all there, and so on. And it's all, and in fact, he said that this is sort of, if you like, one of the fates of monks and nuns, is that they've done quite enough to avoid low rebirth, but not quite enough to sustain completely low rebirth. So they get this rather nice environment, whereas animals, very intelligent, very able, long-lived, comfortable, there's not very much suffering, nagas, and they get all these sort of spiritual powers and abilities, and they can still practice, but they can't meditate. And he says this is where all of these practitioners who've lost their ethical discipline or their practice or their work, they get reborn there. And then he says, not only that, I mean, it's like, he says 990 million monks and nuns of Shakyamuni will be reborn as nagas. So that's the numbers we're talking about according to this. And then he says, even though their practice is not pure, when they die, when nagas do die, they are reborn as humans, as practitioners again, because of the power of their unlapsed conviction of the teaching. And all of those, except for those who are Mahayana practitioners, will pass into nirvana as Shravakas, and the Mahayana practitioners will become bodhisattvas. So it's saying, look, we're not always able to keep our practice. Sometimes it subsides. Sometimes we can lose our ability to keep a strong ethical discipline. Never mind. You can become a dragon for a while, and then later on you can be reborn and you can carry on your practice. So this is what he's sort of saying here. And Geshe made the point, I remember him saying, he said, you might become a Naga next life. He said, it's really quite important to sustain our practice and sustain our ethical discipline and to sustain these four jobs, our view and our work, carry on doing our work. Because this is what makes us active in our practice. This is what makes us active, sincere practitioners. While we sustain the view, but we don't have the others, then we're still sincere practitioners, but we're not really active. And therefore, we don't have so much effect. And also, there's not so much progress in our practice. Okay? And then there's a couple of other, and it's just the end of the chapter, and it's also just the end of the week, so everything's tying up very nicely. And he also says, the praise of the Exalted One says that sometimes there are some traditions which have said that you can transfer the benefits or drawbacks of virtues and non-virtues. The karma can be transferred from some people to other people. There are occasionally some Asian Buddhist practitioners that say you can do this, but actually, in general, it's very hard to see how Buddhism can accept this. In the end, we are responsible for the actions that we do. We will engage in and benefit from those, or not benefit from those in terms of our practice, and the effect they have on the universe is not as if they're going to perish. And that there takes us to the first part of the general. It takes us to the end of the general characteristics of karma, which was chapter 13, and then next is the varieties of karma, in terms of how karma interacts with, in terms of like a mirror and so on. but most of that, I think, the key point, I think, hopefully, I've been reasonably able to convey what we're talking about. Okay. So first of all, I wish to dedicate any merit benefits from this. So what I'm saying is that anything that's come out of this is of any good, any actions, if you like, that I've been doing, any causes have been created, may they be sealed such that I continue to practice, I continue to improve my practice, my actions. I feel inspired to be able to stop and prevent those things that cause trouble, and also to enable and empower those people and those events which are able to cause benefit. And I would wish for nothing less. I mean, that's absolutely, if I could do that, I'd be so happy. And all of this primarily, the only purpose is for the benefit of all beings. Okay, so and then we can just do a couple of minutes of meditation, and I think personally to think really to think about either the four paths of a practitioner, or the inevitability of our actions, of consequences to our actions.